yesterday, we talked about the end of the fighting. So today we're going to look at a different kind of fight, and that, of course, is the attempt to bring about peace. And we know, and I know you probably remember from world history about how this whole thing just completely changed, not just the United States. You know, the United States' borders stay the same, and government stays the same, and all that sort of stuff. That's certainly not true for a lot of European countries. Although it does bring about numerous changes, like the things that we just saw mentioned in the video, how it kind of ushers in that new era. But certainly World War I changes so many things for Europe. It completely redraws the map of Europe. It creates new countries and new nations, and old empires that had stood for hundreds of years will no longer exist as a result of World War I. And there are plenty of ways in which the peace was approached by some, particularly Wilson, as this opportunity, you know, to sort of reshape Europe, to make things more, bring about a peace that would last forever. That's really kind of the mindset that all of these individuals probably have, is we want to prevent another war from happening again. We have to prevent this tragedy from ever happening again. However, people's ideas about how you do that, about the steps that need to be taken, about what that looks like, were completely different things. And Wilson finds himself very much at odds with other world leaders at this particular juncture. So they begin their the Paris Peace Conference. This is, of course, the peace conference. Leaders from various countries meet in Paris over a couple of months, beginning in 1918 or January of 1919, actually, to start discussing the peace treaties, to officially end the conflict, and to put things sort of back together, or figure out where they go from here. What do they do with this situation now? It is a peace conference that is attended by numerous people. There are diplomats and officials, economists, and so forth, from about 32 different countries there. So it's a pretty darn big gathering of folks. As you can imagine, lots of different ideas are being presented. However, even though there are so many people there and so many different ideas being represented, there are certain leaders that are kind of dominating everything, that seem to have the most influence and the biggest voice in these peace agreements, as well as some individuals or some representation that is noticeably absent from all of this. So the conference, although there are, I don't know the exact number, but like I said, people representing 32 different countries, probably a couple hundred delegates and people talking things out at this Paris Peace Conference, things are pretty much, the show's kind of run by, and most things are pretty much dictated by the four leaders that became known as the Big Four. And those were Woodrow Wilson, so as President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, as well as, I'm not going to ask you to know their specific names, but the prime ministers or leaders from Great Britain, from France, and from Italy. So the United States is president, along with the British prime minister, the French prime minister, and Italy's prime minister. Why those four? Those are the winners, Yeah, those are the most powerful ones because they are technically the winners of the war. So they are pretty much controlling most of the things that are taking place. They have probably the biggest sway and the biggest muscle in all of this because of that. Now, the fact that Wilson is even there, that Wilson even goes to Paris to participate in these peace agreements already, before we even get to a peace agreement, before we even get to the United States government looking at any such peace agreement, already that was very different. It was quite shocking to some people, and it was not welcomed by a lot of people. It's interesting. It always kind of, I find it interesting because it seems like you would think it would have happened before, but Wilson's actually the first president to go to Europe while being a sitting president. So he's the first sitting president to actually travel to Europe, much less to participate in some kind of treaty negotiation. Again, it's one of those things you're like, really, no president had done that? But no one had. Any other treaty negotiations and stuff like that had taken place in Europe prior to this, the president had sent other ambassadors, but Wilson is going to do it himself. And you can see how some people might take that as, Wilson is trying to do what he wants, and he's not considering this, that, and the other. So that was already quite a controversy that Wilson was attending, that he was even going himself. He does bring along some other individuals, but he doesn't bring hardly any Republicans. I think he brought one Republican along with him. Remember, Wilson's a Democrat. So he doesn't bring along anybody on the other side of the equation, anybody on the other side of politics in the United States. So Senate Republicans, who are the ones who are ultimately going to be the ones to decide whether or not any treaty is approved or not approved, they're already pretty angry with Wilson getting off the bat. One, because he attended, he didn't bring any of their voice, any of their people along with him. He only brought a handful of folks to sort of advise him, and he never really consulted with them all that much. And so they're already against all of this and see this as very presumptuous on Wilson's part. They already see Wilson as too much of an over-idealist, that he's just kind of head in the clouds, I'm better than everybody else, I do what I want kind of a thing. And, the fact that Wilson conducts the peace agreements this way is very concerning to them. So Wilson's already got a lot against him, and that's just back home. And that really, he'll notice that a little bit more later. But even during the peace agreements, Wilson finds himself very much at odds with the other members of this peace conference, with the other big four. Overall, they are allies, but they find themselves really butting heads on a lot of things. Because remember, Wilson, what do we call his sort of plan that he wants to see, woven into all of this? The 14 points, which the 14 points talked about a lot of things like no more colonialism, no more imperialism, open diplomacy, all that kind of stuff. Some of those things, the British and the French and others were willing to listen to, but there's a lot that they were like, no way. Because they are already, those are imperial powers as well. They have colonies overseas as well, probably more, Britain certainly more than Germany did, more than France. And they certainly want to preserve that. They have no interest, and they're like, we're not going to give up our colonies, so they don't want to hear any of that stuff. So Wilson ends up having to sacrifice a lot of the things that he wanted, and a lot of those 14 points in order to get any kind of peace agreement and, to get the 14 points that he did get. Because in the end, only a small handful of those 14 points that Wilson had originally outlined, only a small handful of those ever make their way into these peace agreements. Because again, those other victorious nations were not interested in some of that stuff. Wilson goes into this really believing that this is a chance to remake Europe, in the United States' image, and that all of this is really important to make sure that peace happens forever, that this does not happen again, that we include, the defeated nations in all of this. But that was not something that Britain and France and some of the others were willing to do. So going back, let me backtrack just a second, with the big four dominating things and having so many people present, Germany is not. Germany was not included in the peace negotiations, and your other losing powers, delegates and representatives and leaders from the losers in this conflict were not included in the peace agreement. They did not get a chance. Their voice was not heard at all. Wilson didn't like that, but again, the others of those big four go against him on that. Whereas Wilson kind of, again, saw this as this is an opportunity for peace and reconciliation. We need to, bury the hatchet and move forward, and you can't really 100% blame them for it. But, the British and the French saw this as a chance for vengeance. And this was not about peace so much and reconciliation, as it's about vengeance. It is about making sure that Germany pays. It's not about rebuilding everybody and making everything all happy. It is about making sure Germany pays for this, and that Germany is put into a position where they won't be able to do such a thing again. So it's not about creating a system that's more open and more fair, that we don't have a war, which is what Wilson wanted. It is more about we put them down so deep in a hole they won't be able to get out of it, and we're going to show them who the boss is. And so the treaty that ends World War I, which is the Treaty of Versailles, I'm sure you probably remember it from world history, is one of many treaties that come out of the Paris Peace Conference, but this is kind of considered the treaty. And so again here, the theme that you'll notice throughout this is punishment for Germany, punishment for those defeated powers, to punish them and again put them in a place where they wouldn't be able to cause a war again. So there's lots of points in this treaty. It's rather lengthy. We're just going to hit a couple of high points, particularly ways where you can see that this was meant to punish Germany for the war. First of all, Germany has to disarm, or one point is that Germany has to disarm. What does that mean? They have to reduce the size of their military and reduce the size of their armaments and weapons that they keep built up. Again, you see this is about, from those other big four, don't let them have a strong army and all that stuff so they won't be able to attack anybody and all that sort of stuff. They have to give up a significant amount of territory. So Germany's going to have to give up a lot of territory. They have to give up all of their, their overseas colonies that they had in parts of Africa and parts of Asia. That was something that Wilson kind of wanted for all of them, but, they punished Germany by taking away those extra territories. There are also parts of their land in Europe that they're going to lose, that they're going to, be reduced in territory there. France will occupy some of those areas. But probably what becomes some of the most controversial parts of the treaty, because all of it was very controversial for different reasons. One of the very controversial parts was there's a clause where Germany has to accept responsibility. They had to, sometimes it's called the guilt clause, where they had to basically agree to admit that the war was entirely their fault, that they had caused it was entirely their fault, and that they were responsible for the damage, they were responsible for all that had taken place. And therefore, they could be held financially responsible. So the Treaty of Versailles also included, you probably recall from world history, significant reparations that Germany is going to have to pay. Do you remember what the reparations were, what that meant? Money. It means that's money they're going to have to pay to those victorious countries, to Britain, France, and so forth. Money they have to pay essentially in damages. And this amounts to, the equivalent, I think if you adjust it for inflation to today's money, it's something like somewhere close to $40 billion that they're going to have to pay over the course of several years to Britain, France, and several others. It's a massive amount of money. And, it's designed to keep them, economically subservient. It's designed to keep them poor, keep them in poverty, keep their economy low, keep them in a position where they're not going to be able to financially build themselves back up, build up their army, get more territory. We're going to humiliate them to a point where they will not be able to do this kind of stuff again. Wilson did not agree with any of those things, but he compromises on it to get the one thing that he really, really, really wanted out of all of this, which I'll get to in a second. There's also all kinds of new countries. There are lots of new countries that are created out of the Treaty of Versailles because the Austria-Hungary is no longer, as a result of this, that empire is broken up. The Ottoman Empire is broken up. And so you get lots of new countries that were trying. This is where Wilson's whole self-determination thing comes in. Remember, Wilson believed in self-determination for ethnic minorities, and there were lots of different ethnic minorities in those parts of Europe. And so there was attempts to create, for example, Poland, a nation for the Poles, that ethnic group, and Latvia for the Latvians, and Estonia for the Estonians. You could go on, some of those countries that were essentially created at the end of World War I. That, was partly in line with what Wilson wanted about self-determination for ethnic minorities, but it doesn't cover all of them. There just really was no way to really make all of Europe's boundaries respected to all of those ethnic groupings. So that ethnic tension is still there. They do attempt to fix some of it, but it certainly does not fix all of it. But it very much does redraw completely the map of Europe. Again, Wilson compromises on so many things. He compromises on the reparations and blaming Germany for the war and all those kind of things he didn't think was a good idea, in an attempt to save the one thing that he thought was the most important, and that, of course, was the League of Nations. So the one of Wilson's 14 points that he was the most passionate about, that was kind of his favorite, his baby almost, that he was willing to sacrifice so many other things in order to get this, was that League of Nations. We talked about this yesterday, and how this would Wilson is proposing this concept of an international organization. So again, we defined it yesterday, where countries are represented. The idea being that we try to avoid war, we try to talk things out, we have openness, we have transparency, we use other means to try to stop something we don't like from happening. Instead of attacking somebody with our military, we use economic sanctions or something along those lines. So it is agreed in the Treaty of Versailles that they will create a League of Nations, and they come up with all these different charter reasons or all the charter and stuff for the League of Nations. So that is included in it. So it's a very lengthy treaty, lots of stuff going on. But ultimately, the big things, Germany is going to be punished. They have to accept guilt. They've got to pay reparations. They lose their territory. They lose a lot of weapons. New countries are created. France is going to get some of Germany's occupied territory and all of that. But there is going to be a League of Nations created. So Wilson finally, after months in Paris, comes home to deliver this Treaty of Versailles. Because remember, ultimately, the power to ratify or to approve or reject treaties lies with the Senate. So now the Senate becomes the battleground where Wilson has to make his case to them. And there's already a great deal of opposition, as we mentioned, because where Wilson's a Democrat, Senate Republicans have the majority by this point. So he's going to have to not only convince the Senate, he's got to convince the Senate that is dominated by the opposing party. And we've already mentioned that a lot of them were very upset that Wilson did not include them in the peace negotiations, that he even participated in the peace negotiations. So this is already going to be a very, very uphill kind of thing. So there's a lot of opposition to this treaty in the United States and certainly within the United States Senate. So I want to just mention, a few reasons why, because there's kind of two reasons. They're sort of the opposite things as to why people might be opposed to it. There are plenty of people that are more isolationist. There is a growing movement to return the United States to isolationism. What does that mean, isolationism? Kind of being off by ourselves. And people that perhaps oppose the United States' entry into the war altogether, or those that truly felt, and there was a lot of this, of people that said that was a mistake, that we had no business being there, and we don't ever want to get involved in something like that again. And so we shouldn't agree to this because this is going to further involve the United States in a lot of things like that. What about this treaty would they feel is further involving the United States in further conflicts? The League of Nations. That ends up being probably the most controversial part of it, certainly the most controversial part of it for the United States. So some felt that it was, bringing the United States into conflicts that we didn't need to be in. There were those that felt that it was way too harsh, that felt that it was way too harsh on Germany. Certainly a lot of German Americans or people with, German ethnicity or close to that, or any of the defeated countries that felt kind of a sense of identity to them, would have argued that this was way too harsh and demeaning and cruel, and the United States should not support such a thing. And then, of course, you've got people that don't think it's harsh enough. There are some people that thought this didn't do enough to weaken Germany and its allies. And so there's already a great deal of controversy from senators and from people in the United States. So it's a pretty big battle that Wilson is going to have to fight here. Now, in the Senate, the leader of this battle against the Treaty of Versailles is Senator Henry Cabot Lodge. So Henry Cabot Lodge a Republican senator, and he again is leading this opposition to the Treaty of Versailles, or at least opposition to the Treaty of Versailles in its original form, the way that Wilson had presented it. He had a lot of concerns, and he also just doesn't like Wilson. He and Wilson do not get along. He's disagreed with Wilson about a lot of things. And the interesting thing is this, Lodge's objection to the treaty, among other things, the biggest part of it, of course, is the League of Nations. That's his biggest problem, is the League of Nations. And it's not so much that Lodge is an isolationist. We want to think, he's an isolationist. He didn't want the United States to be involved in something like that. I don't think you can really call Henry Cabot Lodge an isolationist. He was in favor of the United States' involvement in the war. He had been in favor of the United States' involvement in Cuba, Spanish-American War. I mean, I think you can argue that he's essentially an expansionist and did want the United States to be involved more in the world. The problem he has with the League of Nations, okay, and this, before I get ahead of myself, Henry Cabot Lodge has, or he and the Senate Republicans here have what they, reservations. They are issues with the treaty. Like, we're okay with this, and this, but we got reservations like this. So they kind of, over several months, sort of come up with their sort of modified version. Okay, so the reservations are, here's what we're not happy with. We suggest these changes. They sort of come up with these modifications after they, say what their reservations are about the treaty. Again, it mostly has to do with the League of Nations. Particularly, there was a part of the charter for the League of Nations that suggested, or that said basically, that member nations, if somebody was attacked or somebody's borders were threatened, what would all the members have to do, you think? They all have to fight, but you're basically obligated. And that's the part that Henry Cabot Lodge has such a big issue with, as well as other Senate Republicans. They didn't want to agree to that. They didn't want to agree to this idea that the United States has to go fight for whoever, because they're involved in the League of Nations. And there's a few other things, but that's kind of the big one. And again, it's not so much that because we don't want to get involved in war, I'm sure that's part of it. But Henry Cabot Lodge simply believed that, that violates the United States Constitution, essentially, because under the United States Constitution, who decides whether or not to go to war? Congress does. Yeah, the Senate does. And he's like, that's Congress's power. That's our power. And so no League of Nations is going to tell us what to do there. And there were a few other concerns, reservations to that respect, is that a League of Nations cannot undercut the power of Congress. It cannot undercut the United States' sovereignty. So it's not so much about we don't want to be involved in the world's problems. We don't want to be a leader. But more that we're not going to surrender our own power. We're not going to surrender our own ability to govern ourselves to a League of Nations. So they come up with this sort of alternate version of the treaty with all these reservations, so forth and so on, and that's what they're kind of arguing for. Wilson gets fed up with the fact that the Senate is dragging their feet and coming up with all these different reasons and trying, Lodge is trying to delay everything, trying to get the public all divided about it. Wilson gets fed up with that, and he decides to go on this tour of the country throughout 1919, giving speeches in various cities of the United States to whip up support for the Treaty of Versailles, believing that he could get the public on his side. And if he got the public on his side, then Senate Republicans would have no choice but to ratify the treaty. So he goes off on this massive public relations tour on trains, going from town to town, trying to get the public, on his side. Really miscalculating public opinion. And so it, was sort of kind of got a mixed response. It wasn't like people were just going crazy to see Wilson. And while I guess you could argue it was relatively well received, it does not cause this massive wave of public opinion and everybody writing their congressman and demanding that how dare they do this to Wilson. That whole thing doesn't happen. Unfortunately for Wilson, it takes a tremendous physical toll on him, eventually resulting in him having a devastating stroke, and he has to cut the whole thing short, and he's actually incapacitated for the rest of his presidency, and is pretty much a recluse the rest of his presidency. No one really saw him very much after that. Probably couldn't walk, probably didn't talk very well. His wife kind of kept him isolated. Some people even argue that his wife was really making most of the decisions at that point, that he really wasn't capable of governing at that point. So it takes a toll on his health, resulting in that stroke, and he dies really just a handful of years later. And so ultimately, as you probably know, the Treaty of Versailles is defeated. Both Wilson's version and the modified version, both the one that Wilson had presented and Lodge's modified version. Because Wilson wouldn't stand for Lodge's modification. He was saying it's my way or nothing. He refused to agree to the modified version that Lodge was trying to support. So ultimately, the United States never accepts the treaty, comes to their own treaties, to their own treaties to actually end the conflict and that kind of stuff. But the Treaty of Versailles is never accepted by the United States. It's defeated because Lodge and Wilson were feuding with each other. Neither of them were willing to compromise. Wilson wouldn't accept Lodge's modified version, and the other way around. There was a growing sense in the United States that we need to get back to isolationism, to traditionalism. Lodge really kind of hit a note there that kind of struck a chord with a lot of American people. Partisanship, and people are just kind of becoming rather disillusioned with things. Wilson had really made this big talk about, making the world a safe place for democracy and all this kind of stuff. But when people looked around them, particularly in 1919, they just didn't see that. And the world looked kind of scary to a lot of people. And it looked like, things were maybe just as chaotic as they had been before. And so that probably scared a lot of people about, we got to worry about what's going on here and not about what's going on, in other parts of the world. So we will see that return to isolationism and traditionalism. We'll talk about that a little bit when we get to the 1920s. To kind of segue into the 1920s and some of the things that characterize it, we're going to talk for just a moment about this sort of transition from war to peace at home, particularly in how this relates to the economy and, again, kind of leading us into some stuff we're going to see throughout the 1920s. 1919, the year, the war ends in 1918. 1919 is the year that the peace is made and all of that stuff we were just talking about is going on. That was an incredibly tumultuous and quite ugly year for a lot of people in the United States. Again, one of the reasons why you saw this return to, isolationism and traditionalism. It is also an election year, the following year, election of 1920, kind of symbolizes sort of a return to older ways. I'm not going to say too much about this election other than the winner of that election is Warren G. Harding, who was a Republican. Again, Wilson had been a Democrat. So we see in 1920 the election of a Republican president. You have a Republican Congress. So this kind of symbolized, and in fact, Harding even ran on this platform of, quote, returning to normalcy. What does that mean, normalcy? I hear it a lot these days, return to normalcy. What do you think that means? Yeah.
That's like how America was before the war.
Yeah, sort of how things were before the war. Before we went and got in the European conflict, we don't want any of that. And, while it probably was a reference to, people are coming back from the war, people are going back to work, we're going to continue to prosper and do all of that. It was also seen, as this, we kind of go back to the way things were before all of that and almost like pretend it didn't really happen. But it's sort of seen as this whole election was sort of a referendum on Wilsonianism, if that's a word. Wilson's idealism on the whole idea of being present in the world and making the world safe for democracy and all of that. And when Democrats lose that election and Republicans win that election, it's seen as a rejection of those things. It's like another formal rejection of idealism. It's another formal rejection of Wilson's ideas, a rejection of the League of Nations, a rejection of the Treaty of Versailles, even though those things have already been rejected anyway. But it is, and we'll see Republican leadership throughout the 1920s, and more of a commitment to those kinds of ideas and values, both economically and otherwise. Now, there's about the economy, and the thing about wars is that they oftentimes lead to economic boom and economic success during it, and then you end up with this sort of awkward transition period as things kind of move back to how they were before the war. And unfortunately, that usually causes a lot of economic distress for some people. So we see this sudden demobilization of the economy. You had all of this production for supplies and materials and all of this stuff. You had that War Industries Board. You had all these things in place to manage labor disputes and all that kind of stuff. But as soon as the war is over, what happens to all of that? It's gone. All of those wartime contracts are canceled. The War Industries Board is disbanded. And so, that production comes to a screeching halt. It's not a gradual thing. And that leads to a lot of economic pressure. And so that's going to lead part of this economic demobilization that happens pretty suddenly. leads to a lot of problems. So this is what I mean saying that 1919 was a rough year for a lot of people. And when a lot of people looked around, they saw a lot of unrest and a lot of even violence, and were quite nervous about that, and that might have contributed to this desire to return to normalcy. There is a great deal of labor unrest in 1919, numerous strikes throughout the country. I think probably somewhere around, I think I read about a fifth of American workers at one point or another were on strike during the year 1919. Some of those strikes were larger than others. Some became violent. But it happens because, during the war years, how would you describe, labor and labor movement and labor unions and all that stuff during the war? Yeah, things were thriving. Labor union membership was up. You had that National Labor Relations Board. They got a lot of things that they had been seeking for a long time: higher wages, shorter work days. A lot of those things they had received because they didn't want labor disputes to back up production and that kind of stuff. But once the war is over, what happens to all that? Again, it's gone. So they don't have that protection anymore. Workers don't have that backing anymore. They don't have that leverage anymore that they once did. And again, as the economy is readjusting, prices were going up, inflation was really high, but their wages were not going up, and so we've got a lot of people going on strike for that reason, but now they don't have the leverage that they once did. And in fact, because of the rise of a lot of other radical ideas throughout the world, there's a growing association of labor unions and of workers' movements with radicalism, with anarchism, with communism. The Russian Revolution had made all that seem very real and very scary, and so they get associated with all those kind of things. So management is coming down super hard on labor unions the way that they weren't or weren't able to during the war years. So there are significant strikes, some of which, like I said, turn violent. And workers are going to continue to see a rollback of all those gains that they had gained during the Progressive Era and during World War I. The 1920s will see union membership plummet, and a lot of that stuff, minimum wage, child labor laws, all that kind of stuff overturned. And so that is beginning here right at the end of World War I for a number of reasons. We also see a lot of racial unrest and racial violence in the years following World War I, particularly in 1919, 1920, and into 1921. What did we see happen beginning in the World War I years regarding African American demographics? What did a lot of African American people in the South do? Yes, a lot of them moving up north. And I kind of mentioned that then this begins that great migration. And so that has completely changed the racial demographic of a lot of cities. And particularly as a lot of soldiers are coming back home and other things, that leads to extreme racial tensions in a lot of those cities. As a lot of white residents resented African Americans being there, saw them as competition for their jobs, resented some of them their economic success. There are plenty of examples where they were just simply flat out jealous that African Americans were thriving in some of those northern communities, that they were establishing communities of their own, where they were establishing successful businesses, where they were really, advancing themselves in the world, and they retaliated against that quite violently. So there were race riots in Chicago, there were race riots in Detroit, and I wanted to briefly just mention as one specific example of the race riot that took place in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921. So this is just a few years after the war was over. And again, there were numerous race riots, but I want to mention this one as a prime example of this, but also because, just quite honestly, this is just something you need to know about. A lot of people don't know about it. This is something that after it happened, everybody involved just kind of pretended like it didn't happen, and there are plenty of people even were told and believed that it was literally a myth, that it never actually happened at all, that it wasn't even true. And it's only been in the past handful of years that certainly people in the Tulsa area and Oklahoma and others have recognized that this did happen, and they need to own it and to recognize that it happened. But in Tulsa, it particularly occurred in an African American neighborhood in Tulsa called Greenwood, actually, that had become a very successful and thriving African American community. Sometimes people call it the Black Wall Street because of the economic success of a lot of these people that were, being successful in their businesses, educated, just really a thriving African American community in this area. And then the specifics of how the race riot gets started, they accused one guy of harassing a white woman and arrest him, and he goes to jail, and they're afraid he's going to get lynched. So mobs of both black people and white people are there outside the jail, and then a shot gets fired, and the whole thing just explodes. But then the next morning, thousands of white citizens descend on this neighborhood, probably about 6,000 or so, that had been deputized, given legal authority to go in and weed out all these people, given weapons by the police, and they just go through and pull people from their homes, burn the businesses, destroy everything, looting homes. In the end, about 6,000 people are arrested in this, none of them white. It was all black people that they went in and arrested for just being there, and being successful. 36, I think, people were killed. And I think about 35, maybe, and again, statistics aren't important. I'm just trying to give you a mental picture here. I'm not going to ask you how many square miles of neighborhood was destroyed. It's to understand the scope of this. Again, you can see this image here. I mean, it looks like it was just bombed out, but it was just destroyed by these angry white people, mad that African Americans were being successful for some reason. About 35 square miles of this neighborhood were just completely leveled and destroyed. It is never recovered. To this day, it is still incredibly poverty-stricken now because of all of that, because most of them leave. Millions and millions of dollars of property destroyed, which those people were never compensated, never paid, at least not until more recent years. And again, this was something that people just swept under the rug and acted like it didn't happen until fairly recently. More recent investigations, looking into this and how it happened and why it happened, found that, the city government literally conspired to, with these white mobs to go and destroy these people's neighborhood, that the police did not protect people, all this kind of stuff. And since there has been a formal apology, they have paid reparations to some of these people. But just to show how ugly that racial tension could be. In places like Tulsa, and you can see why that's such a sensitive subject even now. So it's the 1920s is we're going to see, as well as it being characterized by a lot of economic success and a lot of things that are kind of fun to talk about. It is also characterized by this sense of isolation and turning inward and fearing anything that was different and fearing anything that was seen as threatening and that sort of thing. So lots of transitions to happen. And we'll be taking a look at the 1920s starting next week. So, questions on any of that? Okay, get this stopped.